When people think about the best German tank of the war, the thoughts go invariably to the late war tanks with the fierce animal names, especially the Tiger and the Panther. This is remarkable because these tanks only came into the field in large numbers when Germany was in the process of losing the war. Almost nobody thinks about the tanks which helped Germany win their early victories as being good tanks. This is partly due to the narrow mindset about what constitutes a good tank, which is usually measured by thick armor and a big gun. In other words, a tank which is hard to kill and can kill other tanks. The question is whether this is a sufficient measure for a good tank. I would like to make the case for the Panzer II as the tank which drove Germany to victory early in the war. One of the reasons is because the Panzer II was not a tank the Germans planned to build as their main battle tank. In 1934 the Panzer I with its dual machine guns was considered too light in both armor and equipment, but the intended German medium battle tanks were still in development. As a stopgap the Panzer II was developed in 1935 and 1936. In the summer of 1937, it went into production, and by the summer of 1939 more than 1,100 Panzer II had rolled off the production line. The Panzer II was a production success with an average of 50 tanks per month, a production number which would not be surpassed by any other German tank type until well into 1940, when Panzer III production picked up. The peak year for Panzer II production was 1938 with 669 produced tanks, or an average of 55 tanks per month in that year. Despite the flood of Panzer II tanks rolling off the production belt, the tank was not tested in Spain, where there was ample of opportunity for trial in combat, especially against Soviet-Russian tanks. The Panzer II remained in Germany and became the backbone of the German armored forces. At the outbreak of the war in September 1939, this tank type made 42% of all German tanks. The Panzer III, the intended main battle tank, could only field 87 units, a paltry 3% of the total German tanks. The Panzer II is often lumped together with the Panzer I because they are regarded as the pre-war light tanks which would eventually make way for the medium battle tanks like Panzer III and IV. At closer inspection, the Panzer II was by no means a proverbial driving coffin. The armor was 14 mm thick on all sides. By comparison, the first three versions of the Panzer III which were produced until 1938 had all 15 mm of armor. Even the first version of the Panzer IV had 15 mm of armor. The conversion of the Panzer III and IV to 30 mm of armor only took place in late 1938. The 14 mm of armor was in other words a standard thickness at the time, even for the German medium tanks, which were meant to replace the Panzer II. With regards to firepower, the 20 mm autocannon gave the Panzer II a hard-hitting gun compared to the machine guns on the Panzer I. The autocannon would wreak havoc among infantry and was powerful enough to take out soft-skinned vehicles. Its only drawback was that it was not fit to take out other tanks. Perhaps some would dismiss the Panzer II for this precise reason, but I would argue that at the time it was not self-evident that tanks should be killed by other tanks. Tank-on-tank confrontation had been rare up to the outbreak of the Second World War. The disabling of tanks was not seldom seen as a separate activity, which was outsourced to anti-tank battalions equipped with specialized anti-tank guns. The Americans created their tank destroyer branch as late as 1941 to relieve their tank units from the task of destroying tanks. So, how did the Panzer II fare on the battlefield? The Polish campaign, which started on the 1st of September, 1939, saw the widespread deployment of the Panzer II, with great success. The German armored forces penetrated deep into Polish territory without much difficulty, and Polish forces were bypassed and surrounded in large numbers. Despite the fact that there were no tank battles to speak of, the fleet of 1127 Panzer II suffered considerable losses. A total of 259 Panzer II were disabled one way or another, 23% their number. Historian Matthew Palmer even claims that 75% of the German tanks were knocked out in Poland at some stage. These numbers make the recovery of the German tank force even more remarkable. Despite the significant number of disabled tanks, the amount of complete write-offs was low, only 83 Panzer II or a little over 3% of the total number of Panzer II. The fact that almost all Panzer II could be restored in running order means that this tank type could be restored back into action at a high rate. This is in my opinion a necessary precondition for a tank, easy to maintain and restore when damaged. Although the late-war German tanks were more sophisticated and powerful, these tank types were hard to maintain to the point that half of the tanks of a frontline unit were in repair shops at any given time. Just like the Polish campaign in 1939, the Western campaign in May 1940 also heavily relied on Panzer II. Despite the significant increase of the share of Panzer III in the German fleet from 3% to 14%, the Panzer II still made up 39% of the total tank force, which meant 3% less than at the start of the Polish campaign. Panzer I tanks were significantly phased out at this stage, but the Panzer II remained the most numerous tank type of the German tank force and effectively its backbone. The difference was that in this campaign it would be confronted by an Allied tank fleet, which was comparable to the German one in numbers. The Panzer II had however two advantages over the most common French tanks. Although it had a less powerful gun, it was faster and had a larger operational range. The real test was a clash between the tanks, which happened at the Battle of Hannut between May 12 and 14. At Hannut the French Cavalry Corps clashed with German 16th Panzer Corps. Both sides had each 600 tanks. The German Panzer Corps comprised 256 Panzer II, or 44% of its tank component if we discount the command tanks. During the battle the Germans managed to come out on top despite having 111 damaged and 52 destroyed tanks. If we break down the irrecoverable losses by the 16th of May, only 11 Panzer II were a total loss. So, despite making up almost half the tanks, only 1 out of 5 irrecoverable tanks were Panzer II. If we only consider Panzer II tanks, only 4% of the Panzer II were a total loss. This is comparable to the 3% of complete write-offs at the end of the Polish campaign. Once again, the Panzer II showed its resilience. It could be easily repaired in the field and the Panzer divisions resumed their race towards the Channel coast. Their advance was only halted by the German High Command, who got cold feet. In the year 1940 the Panzer II proved again to be a fast and reliable tank, which could hold its own against contemporary Allied tanks. By 1941 the Germans stretched the limits of the Panzer II during their invasion of the Soviet Union. In June 1941 the German army fielded more than 1,000 Panzer II, among which 743 for Operation Barbarossa, or almost a quarter of their combat tanks for this operation. The Panzer II was at that stage still the most numerous tank type of the German army. By then production of the Panzer III with a 50mm gun had picked up, and with a little over 700 tanks slated for Barbarossa it was not far behind the Panzer II in terms of numbers. The Panzer III was however not represented in every panzer division. 11 out of a total of 17 panzer divisions slated for the invasion of the Soviet Union had this tank type, and only 7 had more than 50 of these vehicles. The Panzer II was represented in every panzer division with an average of 41 tanks per division. The only other tank type which was represented in every division was the Panzer IV with an average of 25 tanks per division. The Panzer II was in other words still a household tank and was still deemed fit for purpose. Although the Panzer II drove to the gates of Kiev, Leningrad and Moscow, the Eastern Front conditions showed the shortcomings of this tank type. First of all, the narrow tracks of 30 centimeters were no longer sufficient in a country with virtually no roads and regular seasonal mud and snow. The Panzer III and IV had tracks of 40 centimeters, and the later tank types like the Panther and Tiger even more than 60 and even 70 centimeters. Second, the tank proved too vulnerable for an environment awash with heavier enemy tanks. The Soviet tanks had stronger armor and a bigger gun. The introduction of the T-34 and the Sherman tank in 1942 in large numbers meant that the Panzer II was both outclassed and outproduced. The Panzer II production was halted in June 1942, and this tank type was phased out of the Panzer divisions in favor of the Panzer III and IV, which the production had picked up by then. In short, the Panzer II was designed and produced as a stopgap in anticipation of the production of the German medium tanks. It proved a great success. It proved easy to produce and to repair. When the war broke out, it was the most numerous tank type in the German army, and as such formed the backbone of the German armored force until the end of 1941. In the field it managed to hold its own, and irrecoverable losses were relatively light during the campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The tank was robust enough, had considerable firepower, and could drive fast. It had the qualities needed for the German campaigns in Western Europe: speed to drive deep into the rear and sufficient firepower to overcome resistance from infantry. On the Eastern Front, the tank proved too fragile to endure an overextended campaign in the mud season and the unforgiving Russian winter. By 1941 it was outproduced and outclassed by new generations of Allied medium tanks, which compelled the German army to withdraw it from production and its frontline units. By 1942 the German production of medium tanks had reached the levels to make the phase-out of the Panzer II possible, and in this perspective the Panzer II had in fact fulfilled its initial purpose to bridge the time to make this happen. It should, however, not be forgotten that this unassuming tank was an essential element for the German army for more than 2 years and helped it to conquer most of the European continent. Thank you for your attention. If you wish to support me, leave a comment, like and subscribe. Please visit the Panzer World website, which is a one-stop shop with regards to German armor stats and facts.